After my conversation with Akashi, I took every spare moment to read thick books on bacteriology, trying to make sure that human experimentation was actually practiced. However, none of these books, of course, mentioned such experiments. Conducting experiments on human beings, especially the infection of diseases such as plague and cholera, which have a high mortality rate, is considered a crime and equated to premeditated, so it was naive to expect that they would be written about openly. But when I began to look for evidence that such experiments were being conducted, something caught my eye that I had somehow not paid attention to before. Near a bookshelf in the lab, I noticed a bookcase with books on it that said, "Take out forbidden." One day during my lunch break, I decided to look in it quietly. Taking advantage of the fact that everyone had gone to the dining room, I went into the room. I had gone into it freely before, and there was no reason to suspect me of anything wrong, but the purpose for which I had come this time made my heart pound in my chest as if I were planning some criminal endeavor. The closet was unlocked, and no one forbade me to open it. It was forbidden to take books out, but it was hardly forbidden to read them on the spot, so I was going to justify myself. But at the very last moment I hesitated. If they misinterpreted what I had done, or moreover attributed to me a malicious intent, I reasoned, the consequences would be terrible. So I didn't touch the cabinet, but the next day, after consulting with Osaka and Sasa, I asked Sagawa, the laboratory technician, "Mesite, can't we see some additional materials?" "Materials? What materials?" He marveled, furrowed his brow, and looked up from his desk. "Some things are hard to understand from lectures alone, and we'd like to see scans of patients, if there are any. We want to know the symptoms of diseases better." "Is that so? Well done. You've been working here long enough. You can look as much as you want," Sagawa said with surprising simplicity, and nodded at the cabinet I had been afraid to go near the day before. "Are we allowed to open this cabinet?" I asked timidly. "Of course. Work hard. There's enough work. Learning to work on your own is not easy." In his own way, Sagawa was in a good mood, appreciating our eagerness. He, our immediate superior, was obviously pleased that it was I, who had always done my work faithfully and had no remarks on the job, who had asked him to do it. This seemed to confirm once again that we could be used for serious work, despite all of Major Takegai's unflattering remarks about us. "You are not to take these books out of this room, do you hear?" Sagawa warned us sternly. From that day on, we had a new occupation. Many of the materials we looked through were, as we had suspected, fresh pictures taken during human experiments. Pulmonary plague, bubonic plague, ocular plague, skin plague. One after another, the photos taken at different stages of the disease, some of which compared different cases of disease depending on the infectious power of bacteria, the number of introduced pathogens, photos that clearly recorded the expansion of the focus of the lesion. So these were not ordinary clinical pictures, and this gave them a particularly ominous meaning. With bated breath, we moved our eyes from one photograph to another. One day we came across a description of experiments conducted at the Anada test site. Bombs were filled with a nutrient medium containing agents of gas gangrene and tetanus and dropped from an airplane. The experiments were aimed at determining the degree of contamination depending on the radius of dispersion of infected bomb fragments. For this purpose, every 10 to 20 meters from the point where the bomb was to fall and explode, poles were dug into the ground and logs were tied to them. And these logs tested the effectiveness of such bombs, depending on the distance to the object, the amount of bacteria placed in the bomb, the temperature of the air, the density of clothing, the size of the area of contamination on the human body, and so on. Sagawa explained to us that logs with blindfolds were tied to poles either in underwear or clothed, leaving only the buttocks or only the face and hands exposed. Care was taken to dress the subjects in clothes that were normally worn by the majority of the population. What healthy, fully conscious people tied to poles must have felt when they heard the rumble of approaching airplanes and then the explosions of bombs in their immediate vicinity. Bomb fragments, sharp pebbles, and grains of sand contaminated with deadly bacteria were embedded in their bodies. The unfortunates fell ill and were then subjected to experiments to cure the horrible diseases, although there was no hope of salvation. Even if by chance someone recovered, they were never left alive. However, experiments with conventional bombs apparently did not have a significant effect because due to the high temperature and pressure arising from the explosion, Most of the bacteria were killed, and the remaining quickly lost activity. Even the bacteria of gas gangrene and anthrax, comparatively more resistant to heat, were almost 70% killed, and of the bacteria especially poorly tolerant of dry environments, such as the plague bacteria, not more than 10 to 20% were preserved. All this, however, may be said to be behind us. We have succeeded in producing bacteria that survive well in a dry environment. Methods of spreading the bacteria without the use of explosives have been developed. Concentrates of anaerobic bacteria have almost been discovered. Well, now you understand, Sagawa concluded his explanation one day, as if to emphasize that our research made sense. Very soon I had to deal with anaerobic bacteria such as gas gangrene, tetanus, and botulism. In the squadron, each section had its own work profile, and we were moved from section to section as needed to perform a variety of duties. One day this led to the first terrible accident since our arrival in the squadron. One morning Sagawa, the lab technician, asks us, "Have you been listening to the lectures on anaerobic bacteria?" Everyone stood there with a confused look. Then I, who had somehow imperceptibly assumed the role of representative of the newcomers, yes, we were told about them, although we didn't learn the material particularly well. Well, you'll soon understand once you start working in the other room. Sagawa took us to room 8 in our own section and put us in the hands of 3 unfamiliar lab technicians. Abe and Otsu were transferred from other sections to help us, and the 5 of us began to work in the same room in our new environment. Ishizuka, a freelancer, showed us what to do. He went to the red laboratory table, took a clean test tube, placed in it a liquid nutrient medium the color of tea, to which was added a preparation of horse liver, boiled it for 6 or 7 minutes, then quickly cooled it down and, having sown gas gangrene bacteria on the medium, he accompanied his actions with explanations. We carefully followed his every movement. The bacteria sown in the test tube were placed in a vessel where anaerobic conditions were created. Then he began to demonstrate the procedure of transferring the bacteria to the new nutrient medium, and the test tube with the most dangerous bacteria grown in it was removed from the vessel. At that moment, the lab technician behind me said something, and I looked around, thinking it was an order of some kind. Otsu turned his head as well. At the same moment, Sasa and Abe, who were sitting across from me, suddenly jumped up with a shriek. "Ouch, it hurts. It's burning. Stay where you are. Don't move." One of the lab technicians shouted and rushed out into the hallway. Apparently, someone had accidentally dropped the tub, and it had broken the boiling test tube. Otsu and I were sitting against the opposite wall of the table, and we were all right, but Abe's face was covered in shards. The lab technician's chin and chest were shattered, and Sasa, who had turned away at that moment, was hit in the back. The victims sat motionless, as if awaiting their final hour, their deadly pale faces contorted with horror. Oru and I were shocked. Sagawa, the laboratory technician, came running. The victims were placed on stretchers and immediately taken to the first department's infirmary, which was located in the main building on the 2nd floor. Otsu and I helped carry the stretcher. Gangrene usually develops when a wound infected by a fragment of a burst shell is infected, and is common in modern warfare. It occurs very easily even in small wounds when they are heavily contaminated. There is not one, but a whole group of causative agents of this disease with similar pathogenic action. The causative agents of gas gangrene are widely distributed in the soil. They produce strong toxins. When infected, the edges of the wound redden, swell, temperature rises rapidly. There is a breakdown of muscle tissue with the formation of gas bubbles. The incubation period lasts only 5 or 6 hours. Then the disease develops threateningly fast, and therefore the best measure to help the victim is immediate surgery. In Sas, who had shards of the test tube embedded in his back, the surgeon immediately removed the affected skin and muscle. Since every minute was precious, they operated without anesthesia, and Sasa was trembling with severe pain, emitting muffled groans. Worse was the situation of the lab technician and Abe, because it was impossible to remove the chin or half of the face. They only had to quickly wipe the affected areas and apply disinfectant. After administering first aid, the 3 unfortunates were taken to the hospital. "Do you think they will survive?" we asked Sagawa repeatedly when we got back to the lab. "Everything will be fine. You don't die from it here. We have excellent medication, and we were able to help them quickly enough. So don't worry." although of course it's a great misfortune. Sagawa sighed slightly, tapping his finger on the table. However, the consequences were completely unexpected and shook us to the core. That very night, Abe poisoned himself with sulfur. What a fool. He had to commit such a scandalous act. A man afraid of his looks. The lab technicians were talking. Their words echoed in my heart. Of course, Abe didn't commit suicide simply out of fear of being ugly. The bleak life in the squad created a fertile ground for suicide in a moment of despair. Abe's misfortune was just the last straw that overflowed the cup of his despair and disillusionment with life. What were we, who had been abandoned by him forever, not in the same predicament? We felt like condemned men slowly climbing the stairs to the scaffold, and we dreaded the future. We could only take solace in the fact that we would be honored as those who had died in battle. After Abe's death, we were plagued by doubts for a long time. Was it really suicide? Why did he go through with it? Could it be that he was simply not treated, so as not to jeopardize the reputation of the doctors in the unit in case of failure? We really wanted to know the details, but we did not dare to ask, and we saw Abe only in the coffin wrapped in a white sheet. The tomb of the heroes was just in front of the entrance to the general ward. Even from the time when our unit bore the name of the Water Supply and Prevention Department of the Kwantung Army units, tablets with the names of more than 300 men who had died at the front or as a result of contamination in the laboratories were kept there. On an elevated area of 120 to 150 square meters, large photographs in black frames stood in close rows on what looked like a large bandstand. Probably because Abe was a suicide. There were no prayers or mourning speeches during his farewell. We stood with smouldering sticks of incense in our hands, hushed and overwhelmed by the fear of death, as if it stood beside us waiting for its next victim. But what we felt was not quite like sorrow for the departed. Deep down we were aware of its inevitability. The faces of my companions, who paid their last respects to the deceased, were stern and seemed to express nothing else. It's about 11 o'clock the funeral ceremony ended. We went out into the corridor. Even here we could smell the nasty odor of mice and rats. There was not enough space in the special rodent breeding rooms, so the cages stood under the stairs leading to the general department. However, we gradually got used to this odor and almost did not notice it. Classes for the funeral began at 1 o'clock, and I decided to take advantage of the time left before lunch to visit my friend Say's. I assumed that I had been brought to the general department as part of the study group I was in just for the funeral, so I thought it was safe to leave. But then Omei from the training department, under whose command we were led to the Tomb of Heroes, suddenly wrote in the remaining time before lunch, "We'll have a class." I was upset, and when we left the general department room, I turned to him. "I'd like to go to the hospital to visit a sick person." "What, to the hospital? Who said I could?" Omi cut me off, looking at me with obvious displeasure. "Oh, Mr. Laboratory Technician Sagawa from our lab," I replied. "Ma'am, tell me you're trying to get out of class, so you thought of going to the hospital." "No way. When I'm on duty, I always follow only Mr. Sagawa's orders," I continued calmly. Omi was obviously looking for an excuse to pick on me, so I referred to the lab technician Sagawa. The thing is, the employees of the training department had no authority over those of us who had already transferred to the lab, but that's why they treated us unkindly. Don't you understand what I'm saying? You're talking about service, and you don't give a damn about the training department. Omi was getting more and more frustrated. I thought he was going to hit me, but one of co-ed's junior freelancers who was passing by asked, "What's wrong?" Omi replied that he didn't like my behavior. "Mr. Omi put me in charge of this case. I will take action," Koida said subserviently. Omi had no reason to refuse Koida's offer. He reluctantly nodded in agreement and went on his way. Because of this unforeseen incident, time was running out and classes couldn't take place. Everyone was waiting for us to be dismissed. I stood still and waited to see what would happen next. Koida didn't move. "Stand still and be quiet," he ordered me quietly. I was getting ready to get my ass kicked. I'd been beaten up by high school students in high school, and I was surprised that I'd never been beaten here where everything was like the army. Koida didn't hit me, though. He was silent. At last the command was given, and everyone dispersed. "You may go now," Koida said, probably reading in my eyes the willingness to be beaten as soon as possible. "Go check on Cess." He also threw in the same words and, without looking at me, walked away with a nonchalant look. For some reason I felt sad and wanted to cry. Coyet's silent sympathy, like night dew, refreshed my soul, which had become calloused by a joyless and monotonous life. I went to the hospital. Someone called my name. I turned around and saw Hayashida. "I'll go with you too," he said, and immediately turned the conversation to another topic. The relationship between Hayashida and Sasa was limited to the fact that they had been breeding rats together for a while. I realized that Hayashida had caught up with me not to the purpose of going to the sick man together. Good man Koda. It would be nice if my team leader was like him. He's such an asshole. I was struck by the anger with which Hayashida spoke of his team leader, Kamiya, comparing him to Kokeda. Kamiya tyrannized Hayashida even after he started working in the lab. Every now and then he would bring up some past misdeeds to him. It wasn't just Hayashida that Kamiya disliked. That's why he was hated by most of the group. You know, I really want to beat up that Kamiya. I don't care if he's a team leader. I won't rest until I hit him at least once, Hayashida said excitedly. But I didn't believe he meant it. Such an intention seemed to me more like the recklessness of a desperate man. After all, there was an imperial decree about soldiers in the squad, which said it must be remembered that an order from a superior to a subordinate is the same as an order given by... We arrived at the hospital. Sasa, who had just had a compress applied to his wound after removing the infected area, was lying on his stomach on white sheets. Seeing us, he could barely keep from crying. It was very bad when they cut him. It was like an electric shock. My eyes were blurred at once, and I even stopped realizing whether I was in pain or not, he complained, telling us how he had been operated on. "We just buried Abe," I said, wanting to tell him the only news we knew. Oh, Salsa was silent for a moment, then added with a wry grin. I almost didn't want to follow his example either. Human experimentation is monstrous. That day, as usual, we worked at the cultivators to grow plague bacteria. The task was small, and having finished work by 2 o'clock, we began to disinfect the laboratory table and dishes. "Maybe we'll be able to leave early today," said my neighbor. "Who knows? We might get reassigned to another job," I said. We were whispering, afraid not to be overheard by our superiors. Our constant and deepest desire was to have some rest. We were all thinking of one thing: to sleep as soon as we had a free minute. Soon a communications officer entered the workroom. One man quickly to the basement of the main building, on the carrier. We stopped work at once, and each of us was ready to go immediately. We were trained to automatically follow any order. "You go today, Akiyama. You can go just like that. Room number 26, Sagawa said. I quickly washed my hands and went down to the basement. My path lay through a gloomy corridor, which was given an ominous appearance by its unusual colouring. The ceiling and walls were painted red, a colour that insects can't stand, to keep out flies, mosquitoes, and other insects. Daylight did not penetrate here, and the day was no different from the night. There were only a few lamps with no lampshades hanging from the ceiling, and the corridor was always dark. So it looked like a long, narrow tunnel, with dark red blood on the walls. I felt as if I were walking toward a great danger. Suddenly a wild cry came to my ears, like the roar of a wounded animal. The shrill sounds echoed repeatedly through the corridor, echoing off the red stanzas. I looked around fearfully and kept walking. Soon I saw, in front of the entrance to the laboratory, 3 employees of the squad holding a log by the hands. The screams of this unfortunate man were what I heard. One of the employees pushed him in the back, and the victim was dragged into the room. I watched the scene without moving. For a long time I had wanted to see with my own eyes and be convinced that experiments were really being carried out on living people, but now I was not glad that I had come down to this cellar, because from the very first steps I began to feel a feeling close to terror. "I have arrived at your disposal," I reported to the senior laboratory assistant who came out of room number 26. "Good. Come in and put on overalls," said the owl, and with a concerned look entered the next room. On both sides of the corridor, where I came, are located laboratories. Because of the heat, almost all the rooms had open windows facing the corridor. It felt like the atmosphere here was much more tense than the labs in the Takagi section where we worked. Opening the first door, I found myself in the room where the disinfection shower was located. Here I was treated with carbolic acid, then put on rubber overalls like a lightweight diving suit, and was again treated with disinfectant. These clothes were almost identical to the ones I had to use when conducting experiments on animals. It was tightly fitted all over the body. Behind my back was a small oxygen machine. Opening the second door, I again reported that I was ready to begin work. In the middle of the room, a man was tied to a black iron cot, as if smeared with tar, and was struggling desperately in the hands of the assistants. People in overalls like mine held the victim indifferently like automatons. The log defended himself with terrible strength, although his hands and legs were already bound. It was a healthy man of normal fatness. The person used for the experiment, as well as the experimental animal, must be healthy, because if he is sick and weakened, the results of the experiment will not reflect the picture of the course of the disease in normal conditions. Therefore, in the prison of our detachment, special attention was paid to nutrition and hygiene. This was its main difference from ordinary prisons. I brought medicines and instruments, as I was ordered, and watched the military doctor administer an injection. I did not know the purpose of the experiment, what was being injected into the man's blood, but judging from the way the timekeeper carefully watched the course of the disease after the injection, I realized that the rate of action of some bacteria was being tested. The unfortunate man was writhing in terrible agony, uttering heart-rending cries, but at last subsided. Apparently his strength was exhausted. The experience lasted 2 or 3 hours, which seemed to me an eternity. In the evening I was ordered to take his corpse out. He looked terrible. The whole chest and face of the test subject became dark purple because of subcutaneous hemorrhages. Lymph glands under the arms and in the groin terribly swollen, and the skin in these places became dark red, like a ripe peach. I had already seen pictures of logs that had died such a painful death, so I had some idea of what they must look like in reality. And yet now, when I was shown a corpse disfigured beyond recognition by disease, I almost fainted when I looked at it. I involuntarily averted my eyes, but before me still stood the terrible image of the dead man, with his lips twisted in agony, and the gleam of the bloodshot whites of his half-open eyes, which seemed to stare at me with hatred. Someone who often deals with corpses doesn't care. And how should a doctor feel, who injected a living person with his own hands, knowing ahead of time that he will die? Could he hardly be calm after such a brutal murder committed with his own hands? Does research have to involve such cruelty? Was it really necessary to conduct such experiments in order to create a new weapon, win the war with it, and appease the Emperor's heart? Such thoughts intruded on my mind. Of course, these thoughts were not so distinct at the moment when I, almost unable to remember myself from horror, took the corpse away, but later they became clearer and constantly tormented me. The corpse was dipped in a strong solution of carbolic, and I piled the dead man on a cart and wheeled him away. The journey through the ominous underground corridor from the laboratory to the crematorium seemed to me infinitely long. Shocked to the core, I walked like a blind man, pushing the cart and constantly bumping into various objects. Every time the cart hit something and the corpse bounced on it, it seemed to me that this terrible lodge was about to jump up and rush at me. And then the horror engulfed my whole being with such force that I began to get chills, although it was the height of summer and the temperature in the corridor was high. Besides, the cart rolled with such a tedious creaking and squealing that sometimes it seemed as if all the souls of those who had been tortured here before were stirring and moaning around me, mourning for the next victim. A tall pipe, the purpose of which I still did not know, turned out to be the crematorium pipe. There was an electric bell to announce the end of the experience. So when I reached the open door, 3 employees were waiting for me. After handing them the cart with the corpse, I took a glimpse of the furnace and hurried out of the horrible place. But for a long time I could still see the ghastly grin of the dead man's teeth, and was haunted by the nauseating smell of corpse. Until now I had not paid attention to the smoke from the chimney, but now at the thought that below, under this chimney, which is visible from the laboratory, burning corpses, I got a shiver and spasms clutched my throat. True, around the crematorium, there was no odour from the corpses being burned. Apparently for this purpose the pipe was made so high. But what was injected into the logs? It is known that no matter how dangerous plague bacilli are, death does not occur 2 or 3 hours after their introduction into the body, even when infected with the mnemonic form of plague, in which the mortality rate reaches 100%. The incubation period lasts more than a day, and the patient does not die until 2 or 3 days later. If this is so, what was the experience I observed? No, it was not the usual plague germs that were injected. In experiments with plague germs, never use oxygen dicers. It is not necessary. Obviously, It was some extremely dangerous experiment. Was it the toxin of the plague bacilli? I don't think so. I have not heard of such incredible things. I don't believe that death from the plague could occur in 2 or 3 hours, was the reply of a doctor to whom I consulted after I had already returned to Japan. In one way or another, our squadron carried out researches and experiments which, it would seem, should not be from the point of view of ordinary ideas about the tasks of medicine. It was not easy to succeed in multiplying plague bacilli artificially, variants of plague pathogens, the most terrible of all infectious diseases, grown artificially, turned out to be low, and their storage, a matter of complex and troublesome. To wage bacteriological warfare, it was necessary to find a reliable method of preservation so that for a long time the bacteria did not lose their virulence, and to grow such bacteria that would remain viable when dried. To this end, artificially grown plague bacilli were injected into the human body, using the spleen and blood of the subject as a nutrient medium. These microbes were then reintroduced into healthy people. In other words, viable, virulent microbes were grown by repeated passage through a living organism. Mice and guinea pigs were used to determine the virulence and toxicity of plague bacilli, as well as for the preparation of serum. In these cases, experiments taking into account individual characteristics of animals were carried out several times. The results were then tested on humans, and only then were they considered final. There was a point of view that since artificial multiplication of plague microbes and their dissemination is quite difficult, their effectiveness can be achieved only by direct introduction into a living organism. Naturally, numerous experiments were conducted for this purpose. All sorts of other experiments were conducted, about which we learned from educational movies, as well as from fragmentary information from the conversations of elders. Some experiments, for example, were to determine how much serum made from horse blood could be injected into human blood, or how much air should be injected into a human vein to cause death. It was said that after introducing more than 100 grams of horse serum into the blood, a person would begin to experience unbearable suffering, and after introducing about 500 grams, in most cases, death would occur. Following me, Sasa was assigned to clean up the corpses, and after Sasa Hoseka. Both of them said that soon they, like me, had no strength left to resist, and felt like logs that had been lying tied up in the laboratory for days. Well, have you seen the experiments with the logs? I hope you are braver now, Tsuchitsuka, the usually taciturn, duplicitous and deceitful military doctor, said to us one day afterward. I thought with disgust, that's it. It turns out that we were forced to do this terrible work to make us brave, and indeed unnoticed by ourselves. We gradually got used to everything and became indifferent to the suffering of others. From the sections where experiments with cholera, typhus and gas gangrene were carried out, corpses were coming in almost daily, so smoke was continuously rising from the high chimney of the crematorium into the sky. During the incineration, the corpses were doused with gasoline several times to burn them to ashes. How many people were literally turned into smoke, wiped off the face of the earth? If we assume that on average at least 500 people were wiped out each year, the number reaches 3,000. Komiya is getting what he deserves. I was resting after a late dinner when Hayashida visited me. Can't you go outside? I need to talk, and I can't do it here, he said to me. Contrary to his usual expression, his face was serious. I thought I was in some kind of trouble, so I went outside. It was probably about 9 o'clock, but it was not yet dark. The rays of an invisible sun were colouring the sky a pale pink. It was the moment when the scarlet ball of the sun, of which the songs sing, had already disappeared over the horizon, but night had not yet replaced day. At this hour, the longing for the homeland is especially intense. We sat down on the concrete barrier of the pool. We're going to teach that dog Komiya a lesson tonight, Hayashida said, scratching the edge of the barrier with his heel. No, how many of you are there? I wondered, assuming he decided that the day we'd gone to the hospital. There's a whole group of us. We've already agreed on everything. Look, it's a dangerous business. I thought Hayashida's intentions were reckless, and each of us knew what beating up a superior officer could do in the army. I realize all this, but I can't stand it any longer. Let it be the brig, let it be anything. It doesn't matter. I mean, every day it's like being in prison. No matter what threatens us, it won't get any worse. Maybe you're right, but think again. What if you get court-martialed? Then we won't see each other again. Hayashida didn't answer. When I recalled all of Kamiya's bullying of his subordinates, it certainly seemed to me, too, that Kamiya should have been avenged. But I couldn't forget for a moment that even if the revenge plan succeeded, still in the end Hayashida and his comrades would only lose from it, and I felt sorry for them. I knew that Hayashida had endured Kamiya's abuse for more than 2 months before deciding to take the desperate step, so it was hard to bring myself to talk him down and chide him for being unreasonable and irascible. In words, I was against his designs, but in my heart I was ashamed of my cowardice. I thought you would approve, and you, Hayashida suddenly said with contempt, looking at me with contempt. Call it what you want. Cowardice, 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 but I'm worried about you. I tried to justify myself. I understand, but Hayashida thought for a moment, then waved his hand and said in a different tone, All right, I guess I shouldn't have talked to you about it. There was an oppressive silence. Well, have you changed your mind? I asked again after a while. If you're against it, I'd rather not go through with it, but it's too late to think about it now. The darkness of the night slowly enveloped the town. It seemed to rise from the ground, and so the high dome of the sky, still illuminated by the rays of the setting sun, seemed unusually beautiful. We silently returned to the barracks and coldly said goodbye to each other. That same night, shortly after lights out, Kamiya was attacked. When Kuzuno Morishima and I ran there after hearing the commotion, the officer on duty was already there. The barracks was cordoned off by the guards. Kamiya ran into the kitchen with blood all over him. The officer was saying to someone, Now these scoundrels will get it. Nahals was heard here and there, but nobody really knew what had happened. When I went to the kennel the next day and learned that Hayashida had not gone on duty, I felt bad. I feared that it was unlikely that I would ever see him again, and I thought that he probably hated me in his heart for not approving of what he had done the day before. Everyone in the department thought that since Hayashida and his comrades had insulted a senior officer, the matter would not be confined to the garrison brig, that they would certainly be sent to Sinjing and tried by court. Sasa returned from the hospital after 10 days. We're so glad you're back. Usaka and I greeted him, shaking his hand. It's better in the laboratory than in the hospital, Sasa said, looking around the room with a soft and amazed expression on his pale face. Sometimes we had thought that a hospital bed was better than our dreadful, dangerous work, but now, seeing Sasa's joy, we realized that it was probably better to be in a laboratory with friends than to fight death alone. How's your wound? Can I see it? I asked. Is it healed? Osaka picked up on that. It doesn't hurt, but it itches like frostbite, Sasa said, pulling off his shirt. The scar was the size of a copper nickel. It had been stitched up without skin grafting, and now it was wrinkled and looked like the neck of a knotted bag. Nothing, after all, could be seen under the shirt. Here was Abe really feeling sorry for himself. We have to be more careful now, Sasa continued seriously. But how do you know where trouble will come from? About a day and a half to 2 days after transferring plague bacilli to a new nutrient medium, they form a clearly visible colony. Tubes with matured microbes were placed in boxes arranged so that they could be fixed one by one in special nests. The boxes were transported from the laboratory to the storage room on handcarts. That's what I did every day. At first glance, the work was simple but dangerous. If I tripped or bumped into something, the cart could tip over, and the accident that Abe had suffered could happen again. I already knew what the plague was, and my mortal fear of the disease made me extremely vigilant. One day, as usual, I drove the crates, deposited them in storage, and to delay my return to the laboratory a little longer, decided to take a roundabout way. Pushing an empty cart in front of me, I walked down a long corridor that I had never been in before. Many windows and doors of some laboratories faced the corridor. It was hot. Some of the windows in the doors were open, and through them I could see what was being done inside. A strange glassed-in room caught my attention. Laboratorians in white coats were standing around this room and watching something carefully. I looked closely and saw that naked bound people were shaking and convulsing in it. What kind of experience was this? I did not know. There was only a sign on the door that read, No. 5. I stood in front of this room for only a few seconds. Suddenly I heard someone's low voice. What are you doing here? I took the tubes with bacterial culture to the storage room, and now I'm going back to the lab. I answered the lab technician without hesitation. "There is no way through here, turn back," he said and nodded in the direction I had just come from. He had a look of surprise on his face, as if he wanted to ask, "Where could a teenager come from?" And I broke out in a cold sweat. What's going to happen to me now? Without a second's hesitation, I turned around and went back to my lab. "And what is this laboratory number 5? I shyly asked Sagawa one day. "There they study the effects of frostbite on the human body." "Did something happen?" Sagawa asked, and, seeing that I was a little embarrassed, briefly told me about this laboratory. This is what I learned from his story. Unit 731 was engaged in research in the field of bacteriology, not to prevent the spread of infectious diseases among the Kwantung Army units, but to study the possibility of using bacteriological bombs against the enemy. In addition, the unit investigated the effects of frostbite on the human body. At first, this research was aimed at protecting soldiers and officers of the Kwantung Army from frostbite, but then this work took a different direction. They began to conduct experiments to create freezing bombs. Degrees of frostbite. The first-degree redness and swelling of the ears, the tip of the nose, limbs accompanied by pain and itching. After 2 or 3 days, the pain goes away. In Manchuria, where frost reaches 40 degrees, such frostbite can occur frequently. In second-degree frostbite, superficial blood vessels are affected, blisters appear and suppuration begins. In such cases, gangrene may occur. In areas of frostbite loss of sensitivity, even a needle prick is not felt. The skin darkens and acquires a greenish color. Violation of blood supply leads to wet gangrene. If there is intense evaporation of fluid, gangrene passes into dry gangrene. This is the third degree of frostbite. At the third degree, can even begin to deaden the ligaments and bones, and then the fingers and toes rot and fall off. To find ways to effectively treat frostbite, our squad conducted various experiments on humans. The glassed-in room in Laboratory No. 5 was one of the experimental chambers. Naked people were placed in such a chamber and, gradually lowering the temperature in it, studied the effect of cold on the body. The purpose of the experiments was to establish after what time and at what temperature comes death, as well as whether it is impossible to revive a frozen person. The results of such experiments were used to study the possibility of creating freezing bombs. Such a bomb, according to the inventor's plan, was to cause a sharp drop in air temperature when exploding in the location of enemy positions and thereby cause frostbite, disabling the living force. Its radius of action should reach at least 500 meters, but the radius of action of the bombs that were created did not exceed 100 meters. Practical use of such bombs was not economical, so further research was conducted to increase their effectiveness. As for the remedy against frostbite, it was never created. It was found that increasing the functional activity of the liver increases the body's resistance to cold, and that immersion of the frostbitten part of the body in a cold bath has some effect in case of weak frostbite. One day Hamanaka burst noisily into the barracks and barely crossing the threshold. And, "Hey friends, remember the time Kamiya got beat up? They say no one got hurt. It's like the squad leader decided to keep it quiet." "Is that really true?" I asked excitedly, looking forward to meeting Hayashida, and immediately felt remorse for having spoiled his mood with my lectures. "Oh, that's great. Now all the freelancers will have to think about it," Hamanaka concluded, not when he hated bosses. After Hayashida, he'd gotten the worst of it from the bosses. Working in the general department, he had gotten the news before most of the freelancers and passed it on to us. That's why the mean, vindictive Omi, his superior, was especially cruel to him. In addition, Hamaka was very handsome, and this probably also annoyed the ugly Omi. According to Hamanaka's story, Hayashida and his comrades were first to be sent to Shinjing, and there tried by court-martial for beating up their superior. But on that unfortunate evening, Kamiya, losing his head from rage at the attack on him by his subordinates, grabbed an infantry rifle that came to hand and began to swing it. From the impact on something hard on the weapon was damaged the national emblem. Quis chrysanthemum, that is, a new crime was committed. Therefore, at the trial it would certainly come out, and this is such a dishonor for the squad that the head of the squad decided to keep the whole story in secret. That evening everyone went about with a kind of lightened face. After dinner until bedtime, some of us wrote letters to our homeland, some of us wrote down our impressions in a diary. True, we doubted that all our letters were delivered to our relatives. It had been 2.5 months since we arrived at the detachment. During that time I had written about 10 letters home, and had received only one from my mother. My fellow soldiers had also received at most 2 letters each. But for all of us, the comfort was the very process of writing letters. It somehow brought us closer to our parents and friends back home, so everyone wrote home carefully and diligently. Diaries were not allowed to write about work. Like letters, they served only for our own comfort and contained nothing but personal reminiscences. One evening, while we were busy writing letters, the door suddenly opened and Omi came in. "Hamanaka, what are you looking at?" He asked at once, and without looking at the others or answering the greetings, went straight to Hamanaka, who quickly hid something under the table. "Monsieur Sen, whose picture is it?" I don't have anything," Hamanaka replied hesitantly, adjusting his glasses with his fingertips. "Why aren't you following orders?" Omi pushed Hamanaka away and pulled out the photograph hidden there from under the table. "Ooh, who is this woman?" he asked angrily. We vaguely guessed that Hamanaka was friends with the daughter of a doctor, Imado Mitsuyo, who also worked in the general department. We knew from the conversations of the freelancers that his daughter was very beautiful. Of course, Omi couldn't help but recognize her in the picture. "This is a picture of Imado's girlfriend," Hamanaka said calmly. What does that mean? You bastard? Did you get it from her?" "No, I found it," Hamanaka lied. I trembled with fear for Hamanaka. There was an undercurrent of defiance in his answer and demeanor, and it couldn't help but piss me off. "You found it? You're lying," admiring the girl's picture, smirking, and probably thinking, "You bastard, that you're doing the right thing? I'll get—" Omi put his right hand behind his back. "He's going to hit me," I thought. As if preparing to take the slap, Hamanaka took off his glasses and, barely containing his excitement, continued. "Mr. Omi, don't you believe me? I have indeed found her. But if you think I'm not telling the truth, please do whatever you want to me. Look at me." Omi reprimanded himself and, lowering his hand, took a long look at Hamanaka's face, pale, nervously twitching. "If you lie, expect no mercy. Understand. I'll give the photograph to Mr. Imado myself." With those words, Omi walked out of the room with his boots thumping loudly. He had to admit that he was defeated this time, but his ominous look warned him that he would take revenge on Hamanaka at the first opportunity. As soon as Omi was out the door, Hamanaka suddenly burst into tears. "You bastard! What a bastard!" And he had something to cry about. Unaccountable longing, frustration, shame, all of these things caused him to feel a storm of emotion, and most of all shame. He was ashamed of himself, ashamed that he had lied, as if he had found the photograph, which in fact had been given to him by the girl he loved. He was in excruciating pain that this thing precious to him had fallen into the hands of a strange, dirty, cruel man because of his own cowardice. A great consolation to us was watching movies on Saturdays. In most cases, we were shown narrow film movies about experiments conducted in the detachment. Demonstration of such movies was like a continuation of classes, and yet we always waited for Saturday. So one day we were shown a movie that was a little different from those shown before. It was a documentary about the practical use of plague bacilli that we had grown ourselves. It was intended only for private showing in the squadron as illustrative training material for personnel working on the cultivation of plague bacilli. It showed the actions of a sabotage group in one of the Manchurian villages, which was conditionally assumed to be the location of the main enemy forces. The action in the movie unfolds as follows. Disguised saboteurs under the cover of night darkness, with baskets similar to those in which pigeons are usually carried, penetrate into the village, which is in the deep rear of the enemy. In the baskets are plague-infested rats with fleas parasizing them. Taking cover in the shade of buildings and trees, the saboteurs quickly open the lids of the baskets. One rat jumps out of the basket, followed by a second, a third. Inside, the basket is divided into several compartments so that each time the lid is opened, only one animal can jump out. When infected with the plague, the rats are very thin and their eyes sparkle like glass beads. Released rats hide in pantries, behind household utensils, in wall crevices and mix with local rats. Fleas that parasitize plague-infected rats jump to healthy ones. Soon plague breaks out among the rats of this village. Numerous fleas, sucking the blood of diseased rats as well as flies, spread the infection. 2 or 3 days later, the first plague patients appear in the village. The screen shows flies, countless clouds of flies. They land on the sputum, saliva, nasal secretions, and feces of the plague patients, and then fly to the foodstuffs and transfer to them the plague bacilli that are contained in the secretions of the patients. A person consuming these products becomes ill with the pneumonic form of plague. Other ways of infecting the population were also used. Plague bacilli were placed in test tubes, which were then thrown into wells and reservoirs. Automatic pens with plague pathogens in their caps were lost on roadsides. Disguised in the dress of Chinese peasants, members of sabotage groups went to villages and distributed sweet cakes with stuffing, i.e. infected with plague to children. The contamination of wells is particularly dreadful. In Manchuria, wells are the main source of water supply. In some parts of Manchuria, depriving the population of wells is like passing a death sentence on them. If large numbers of virulent plague bacilli enter the bloodstream, there is a general blood poisoning and the person dies. When a person becomes ill with plague, the fever alternating with severe chills, severe vomiting, bloodshot eyes, legs braided like a drunk, speech becomes unintelligible. There is inflammation of the lymph nodes, and due to the high temperature begins to dry skin. Then in the tissues surrounding the lymph nodes, inflammation develops and the skin darkens due to subcutaneous hemorrhages. The disease usually lasts no more than a week, and then, as a rule, death occurs. Cases have been observed in which old people and those weakened by the disease have died much earlier, even before the lymph nodes become inflamed. All villages where plague epidemics broke out were usually burned to the ground. In some cases, the virulence of plague bacilli was weak, and the disease took a protracted character. The tumor of the lymph nodes fell off and came as if a full recovery, but after 20 or so days, the disease broke out with renewed vigor. Given the insidious nature of the plague bacilli, all members of sabotage groups returning from a mission were isolated from others. They were strictly quarantined away from the unit for several days, and their clothing was carefully inspected and treated. Hayashida returned from the brig after 10 days. He stopped me as I was leaving the mess hall after dinner. "I'm sorry. I'm guilty before you. I really shouldn't have gotten involved." "No, it's good to have you back. I was always thinking about what would happen to you. And I thought a lot that night, too, about what to do. But, I couldn't do otherwise. I'd made a promise and I didn't want to be seen as a coward. It was already agreed. I had to drop the training rifle. That was the signal." That's how Hayashida began his story. According to his story, it went like this. Komiya was on duty that evening. It was decided that when he was making his rounds, Hayashida would give the signal. The decisive moment was approaching. Dead silence reigned in the barracks. All but the conspirators were asleep. Hayashida, pretending to be asleep, held one end of the cord in his hands. The other end was tied to the butt of a wooden training rifle that stood in the pyramid. Hayashida's plan was simple. He would pull the cord, the rifle would fall, and that would be the signal. When he heard Kamiya's footsteps, he was somewhat confused. Pretending to be asleep, Kamiya said mockingly as he approached Hayashida's bunk. "What am I waiting for?" An anxious thought flashed through Hayashida's mind, and he yanked the lanyard. The rifle fell to the floor with a clatter. "What? What is it?" Kamiya shouted, still not realizing what had happened. Several people who had been tensely waiting for the signal jumped up from their beds and started grabbing training rifles from the pyramid. "Shoot," shouted someone and jabbed the butt of a rifle at Kamiya. "You bastards! What are you doing, rioting?" he shouted wildly. "No, don't make any noise. We're not soldiers now." And the furious Kamiya, who was being struck from all sides, grabbed one of the battle rifles in the corner and waved it wildly. The guards came running after Kamiya, spitting out his teeth and with a bloody face, had jumped out. When order was restored, Hayashida and the others who had been involved in the night's incident found themselves in the... But it happened that at the very beginning of the investigation, the issue of the 1905 model infantry rifle that Kamiya had shaken came to the forefront. A national emblem, a chrysanthemum, was damaged on the military weapon. Probably Kamiya, in a fit of rage, hit the stove with the rifle. What happened in the detachment that night was known only to the War Ministry and the Kwantung Army Command. From the troops, this fact was kept in strict secrecy. On the orders of the detachment chief, the case was dropped, and all the participants in the massacre of Kamiya returned to their group. Our former recruiter, Nakano, was appointed to replace Kamiya as group chief. Kamiya was transferred to one of the squad's branches. After finishing his story, Hayashida thought for a while, and then, as if summarizing, concluded. Yes, but we didn't gain anything from it. On the contrary, we'll be watched now. Whatever you say, but somehow I feel embarrassed in front of my comrades. They wonder if everything will stay the same. I don't have any hopes for the future either. I've already reconciled myself to the idea that all my life will have to deal with rats and mice. What can I do? I'm in the same situation, but don't be discouraged. Let's take a walk. Forget about everything for a while. Would you like to walk to the airfield? I suggested it, wanting to change the subject. I didn't know how to distract Hayashida from his sad thoughts, so I kept repeating like an automaton. So get it. Forget it. Don't think about anything. We leisurely headed towards the airfield, but suddenly Hayashida stopped. You know, now that I look around, I feel like running away from this hell. In my heart I realize that it is impossible, but I have a bad temp. I will not rest until I do not fulfill what I planned. I was astonished. The thought of escape had crossed my mind more than once, but each time I convinced myself that I had to overcome this temptation at all costs. And it was because I was always trying to get rid of this temptation that I was tormented by the thought that one day prudence would change me. Hayashida and I sat on a bench in the garden until late in the afternoon. As evening came on, the heat of the day was replaced by the coolness of the evening. Our conversation was sluggish, but we were just the two of us, and that alone was a kind of peace for us. At the location of the training department, the alarm sounded. We stood up and said our goodbyes. After giving Hayashida a glance, I hurried back to my barracks. A youth ruined. As I stopped at the entrance to the room, I heard Omi's sarcastic voice. Entering the room, I saw Morishima and Kuno kneeling, listening respectfully to their superior. Hamaka hadn't returned yet. Where was he? Omi asked me, looking me over contemptuously from head to toe. I went for a walk, I answered. You're probably taking Hamanaka's example, aren't you? What did Hamaka do? They say he's always hanging around the government apartments where the freemen and doctors live. I've noticed that lately Hamanaka's been seeing Miss Imado a lot. Omi seems to have come specifically to do something about Hamanaka. Where is Hamaka? He asked, even though he had a pretty good idea himself. I don't know. You don't know? He does not know where his comrade in arms has gone. Do you think that's your excuse? I won't have you making an innocent face. You see, he was alone on duty, and he doesn't know anything. I don't think you're Akashi's countryman. If you think I'm going to treat you like the others, you're wrong. Find Hamanaka. Now, indeed, I'm used to being treated leniently by all the freelancers. The thing is, my co-workers have been slapped around by their superiors many times, and I'm the only one they've never laid a finger on. Not even Omi, and he'd treated me with respect until now. That's why everyone thought I was under Akashi's protection. That's what Omi was so viciously saying now. I was overcome with a heavy feeling. Akashi hadn't shown his face for about a month now, and no one knew where he was. Omi's behavior made me think sadly that Akashi was probably no longer in this world, or that he was in some kind of trouble. In any case, it seemed to me that he would never return to the squad. We met Hamanaka just as we were leaving the barracks to look for him. Omi, without responding to Hamanaka's greeting, cynically threw her. Have you had enough? And, without waiting for a reply, shouted angrily, March to the barracks. Now, when we entered the barracks, the interrogation began. Hamanaka, you said you found a picture of Miss Imado? That's right. And you're still lying to me? Hamanaka lowered his head dejectedly. He realized that Omi knew everything. Perhaps he had learned about the photo from Imado herself, or maybe he had tracked them down during their date tonight. Ready to confess everything, Hamanaka spoke softly. I'm sorry, I cheated. The card was given to me as a gift. I've known about it for a long time. Tell me honestly, why were you late for curfew today? I was out with Mrs. Yamado, and I was a little late, Hamanaka said with the determination of a man who had been pushed to the wall. I was struck to the core by his calm tone. We'd been told all along that love was a crime, and to admit it openly was shameless. But Hamanaka didn't seem to care at all. In the light of the electric bulb, his eyes glistened and his pale cheeks twitched slightly. You have the nerve to answer like that. Don't you think your behavior is unacceptable? Omi asked, somewhat perplexed, but Hamanaka remained silent. Omi repeated his question a second and third time, but Hamanaka was as if he had water in his mouth. Nakayama, what do you think? Omi suddenly turned to me. About what? I asked innocently. I knew he was asking me about Hamaneka's love affairs, but I pretended not to understand. Don't you, you bastard, listen to what I'm saying. I'm asking you, what do you think of Hamaneka? I knew perfectly well that if I answered as Omi wished, I would be forgiven. But suddenly I felt that I could not condemn Hamanaka, not because I realized the inevitability of love, but simply because I was overwhelmed by Hamaneka's extraordinary serious in the whole squad, isolated from the world by a blank wall on which one could justifiably write, "Abandon all hope to all who enter here." Hamaneka was the only one who retained a taste for life. That was clear even to me. Hamanaka must have realized, too, that if he, in order to please his superior, said the non-committal, "Yes, my bad, it would all end well." But he was not the kind of man who built his well-being on such harmless subservience to his superiors. I knew that if I acted to please Omi and condemned Hamanak, I would be safe, but I would be putting Hamanak in an impossible position. So I answered quiet. "I don't know about this at all." "Just like you bastard. You're in on it with him." And Omi drew his right hand back. "Well, it's my turn now. He's going to hit me," I thought and gritted my teeth. Omi struck, and I staggered. I felt hot, all the blood rushing to my face. He knocked Morishima and Kuzuno to the ground with more punches. "No. Do you realize what you're in for? Hey you, Hamaka. You're the reason your friends are in trouble now, and yet you still prefer to keep quiet. I know you don't care as long as you don't get hurt." "Hit me." Hamanaka took a half-step forward with a frozen face. "Hey, you, listen to my orders. Hit him properly." So this is what kind of disgusting meanness and malice Omi has gotten himself into. I thought to myself, and with all my might I slapped Hamanaka across the face. I felt guilty in front of him, and the fact that I only hit him with my palm and not my fist was my only form of protest against Omi. Morishima and Kuzuno hit Hamanaka lightly, and Omi ordered them to hit some more. The bullying of us and Hamanaka continued until dawn. Only then did Omi go to his room. Then, for several days in a row, he would come to see if Hamanaka was in the barracks after lights out. Apparently Hamanaka had given up night visits after that incident, and now he sat silently on his mat every night before going to bed. When I saw his motionless figure, I felt uneasy. It was unbearably hard to feel that enmity had settled in our room. "We're sorry to you, but please don't think badly of us. We had no other choice," I said to Hamanaka 2 days after that memorable night. I couldn't take it anymore. "I'm not angry. The fact that you beat me is natural, and it is no reason to resent you. On the contrary, it would have been much harder for me if you had done otherwise." Hamanaka smiled strangely and gave us a quick glance. From that time he became even more withdrawn, and as if forgot about us. But I did not condemn my friend, but rather sincerely sympathized with him. July 1, 1945 came. The morning of that day was fresh and clear, as Sasa, Hoseika, and I gathered in the hallway of the room where the Takegai section was located to change into our work dress. Sagawa, the laboratory technician, entered. "You don't have to change today. We'll have fun, go on a picnic." We looked at each other happily but amazed. None of us had ever had to leave the town for such a purpose. True, we had gone out into the field once, but for practical training. Imprisoned in stone walls, cut off from the world by barbed wire, we played a deadly game only with bacteria, so we were insanely happy to walk in the field with a fresh breeze. We went out of the laboratory gate, and a little while later more than a dozen co-workers, who were working in the vegetable gardens, ran up to us with joyful cries from the barracks. "Let's go for a walk. Let's go for a walk." "Where shall we go?" Excited voices were heard on all sides. "No. So I'm taking them away from you," Sagawa said to Osumi, a freelancer from the training department. "Niece, please," he replied. 9 o'clock struck as we cooked rice, prepared breakfasts and filled water flasks. At last we left the town. Beyond the fence, everywhere you looked, there was a vast flat steppe covered with grass. Streams of air, heated by the sun, were rising above the ground, and so the distant horizon line was constantly fluctuating. Pointing to the northwest, Sagawa said, "The goal of our trek is a Manchu village about 8 kilometers away. We will walk a little further and see it." The grass was green all around, and only where the country road stretched from the side of the Pingfan railway station, yellow-bowled spots were visible on the green carpet. We broke into small groups and moved forward without hurry. Captivated by the mass of new impressions, we did not even notice that there was no road where our way passed. Among the low but diverse field grasses bloomed purple, up to 15 centimeters high irises, some unfamiliar to me flowers of orange color, and sometimes there were even red lilies. I think it has edible roots, Osaka said, and tried twice to pluck a lily from the root, but both times he failed. The ground had hardened, and it was impossible to dig out the roots with his hands. Soon the village appeared. I said that it was a flat steppe, but then, looking closely, I noticed some gentle hills and small hollows. The houses of the peasants, which looked like toys, appeared and disappeared from view in the folds of the terrain. The sun was blazing mercilessly, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my body. Only a weak, gusty, dry breeze blew from time to time on my face and refreshed my heated body. The most impatient began to tap the water flask more and more often. "Hey you, take care of the water. It will be even more difficult from here. You can't drink from wells in the village," Agawa warned. We reached the village around noon. There were no more than 20 courtyards. Low, flat-roofed, clay-covered houses stood in a single row. 2 or 3 small willows grew by the roadside, twisted as if they had forgotten to straighten. Since I came to Manchuria, I had hardly seen any trees. All the inhabitants of this village have a special permit from the army headquarters for the right to live here. After all, this village is some 8 to 10 kilometers from our unit, Sagawa explained to those standing near him. Old men kneading clay under a shed, barefooted children, and women peering out of their houses, all looked at us with curiosity. As we settled down in the shade and unwrapped our breakfasts, the children, who had hitherto kept shyly apart, came closer. Some of us tried to make conversation in their own language and wrote Chinese words in katakana. Sagawa, predictably, won all the guys over with his knowledge of their native language. Taking sweet bean cakes from his duffel bag, he gave them to each of them. From the outside it would have looked quite touching, if it had not been for the strange expression on Sagawa's face. It expressed cruelty and some tension, but at that time I paid almost no attention to it, though I should have known that giving them to the boys was one of the methods of work of sabotage groups, as it was shown to us in one of the training movies. Having drawn cool water from the well, we rinsed our heated faces, wet towels, put them under our hats, and soon started on our way back. If we had walked slowly to the village, we returned much faster. The sun was still high, and it was very hot. As we approached the town, Sagawa played the march of the Kwantung army, and we entered the gates of the town, where we might not be able to get out again for a long time. Several days passed. One morning when we came on duty, we noticed an unusual liveliness in the section. Concerned freelancers were scurrying back and forth along the corridor. From the fragmentary words coming from the laboratory, I realized that a plague had broken out in the village where we were. Seeing with horror, I remembered the sinister smile on Sagawa's face as he handed out sweet cakes to the children. It turned out that our walk was also to test the effectiveness of one of the methods of spreading infectious diseases. The laboratory staff would then take turns traveling to this village to observe how the epidemic was progressing and to test the efficacy of treatment drugs on the spot. This time I was sent as an assistant. Dressed in special rubber suits for self-protection, we felt like we were in a bathhouse under the scorching rays of the bright sun. There was not a single inhabitant on the street. The village was strictly guarded by the soldiers of our unit, in houses where there were plague patients surrounded by fine white metal mesh, similar to mosquito netting, to prevent flies from spreading the infection. All the children whom Sagawa had lavished with sweet cakes had contracted the pneumonic form of the plague, and some had already died. One by one, new sick people appeared in the village. So the clouds of flies and hordes of fleas had already spread the plague bacilli throughout the village. When I, together with the military doctor Sujitsuka, entered one of the houses enclosed by a metal net, we saw such a terrible picture that even I, who had already seen a great deal in numerous experiments and photographs, closed my eyes in horror when it seemed to me that among the corpses I would recognize some little boy from those who played so carefree among us that day. I was ready to weep loudly. Our squad was preparing a new and effective weapon to use in order to win the final victory, so such experiments were necessary. By feeling compassion for the victims of these experiments, I was violating my duty. So I was well aware of this, and yet I could not look at the unfortunate ones calmly. My duty was to assist in the dissection of corpses in order to extract lungs, spleen and other organs for the preparation of preparations necessary for research. I had no desire to enter into the work assigned to me, and I performed it mechanically. Out through the walls we could hear the pitiful moans of the dying, and behind the wire mesh we could hear the loud buzzing of flies attracted by the smell of human entrails. We had not spent more than an hour in the plague village, but my nerves were dizzy and my legs were shaking. My nerves were strained to the breaking point, and I felt completely shattered when I returned to the squad. About a week later, the village was burned. Perhaps not all the inhabitants died of the plague, but since the experience had to be kept strictly secret, it was said that all the survivors were shot. Judging from the movie I have already mentioned, similar gruesome human experiments were carried out on a large scale several times before and after this case. From the winter of 1942 to the spring of 1943, a plague epidemic raged in Noonan, and more than half of the 4,000 or 5,000 farms were burned to the ground. Apparently, even there it was not without the sabotage groups of Unit 731. So far, in Manchuria, as in Central Arabia, Central Africa, and other parts of the world, there are places where there are outbreaks of plague. Noonan is one of these areas, and it is no surprise that the plague epidemic has taken on a wide scale here. But all sabotage was planned so that the plague outbreaks would look natural, and no one would even think about the possibility of sabotage. This may also explain why the operation in Noonan did not arouse suspicion among the inhabitants. Moreover, it was widely believed that it was only through the efforts of Unit 731 that the casualties were minimized. But the virulence of plague bacilli in natural conditions and in culture is different, and their reproduction rate is not the same. Incidentally, in some cases these microbes may differ in their shape. As for the outbreak of plague in Noonan, most experts have come to the conclusion that in this case, the causative agent was artificially grown plague bacilli. The excitement caused by the burning of a Manchurian village had not yet subsided when we received the sad news of the fall of the island of Okinawa. From the radio reports available in the laboratories, and from the newspaper Manchu Nippo posted daily on the wall, we knew of a turning point in the course of the war not in our favor. After the news of the fall of Okinawa, we felt keenly that the war was entering a decisive phase. So the possibility was not excluded that this would be followed by the enemy landing in China or on the islands of Japan proper, but the word defeat had not yet entered our usage. About that time, Ishii, the commander of our detachment, who had flown to Japan, returned. He gathered the squadron and addressed us with a heartfelt speech, in which there was anxiety. There were persistent rumors that this time, as in the summer of 1944, after the fall of Saipan, he insisted on the use of a bacteriological bomb, claiming that it would immediately change the situation on the fronts in our favor. He spoke of the indestructibility of Japan, the land of the gods, of the increased role of our unit, urged us to believe in the final victory and to give our strength to the fulfillment of our duty. But his excitement and incessant emphasizing of our duty only agitated our already tense nerves to the limit. And as if to confirm that we were in a difficult situation, and this was already clear from Ishii's speech, at the evening lecture one teacher to encourage us, "Soon we will create a new weapon that will shake the whole world. Then we will be able to destroy 100 million people." All calculations were based on this one hope. If the top brass says so, then it must be true. In July, anxious days began. Near the airfield were preparing caponias for airplanes. About 1,000 Chinese coolies were mobilized for this purpose, and we were sometimes busy all day long digging trenches and other shelters. One day I, Sasa, Hosaka and I, together with the Freeman Koeda, went to the place of work. We passed the boiler room and walked on, heading toward the second airfield. We saw a scene that reminded us of a distant time. Turf-naked, barefooted Chinese coolies, who looked like primitive people, were indifferently, mechanically digging and carrying earth. There were a great number of them, but no loud conversations or jokes could be heard. There was such a depressing silence that it seemed as if it were not people working, but silkworms swarming. "There are bombs stacked there," said Hosaka, speaking to no one in particular. Looking closely, we saw that there were indeed stacks of red rust-covered bombs to our right, next to the buildings. Each of them was probably as long as a man. Had we begun to make bombs, too? I asked Code. They used to use such bombs at the front, and now they've been sent to us. They're just ordinary bombs. We finished our work at 5 o'clock and went back. while the Chinese worked almost all night long and built 3 shelters in 2 days. There were 7 transport planes in the detachment, but as they were continuously carrying on communication service with the branches of the detachment and performing other tasks of the command, and therefore were in the air almost all the time, 3 shelters were sufficient. On the south side of the town, not far from the residential houses where the administration and freelancers lived, a barracks was built underground in the form of a triangle where up to 2 companies of sappers and gunners, bomb specialists assigned to our detachment. In essence, these were sabotage groups. It was said that they were attached to our detachment for training in the use of bacteriological bombs behind enemy lines. They were supposed to play the role of shock troops, but how prepared they were for this, no one knew. The personnel of these companies consisted of rather old soldiers called up from the reserves, and therefore it could not be said that they were characterized by high morale. On the contrary, it was felt that they were demoralized. Judging from the way they crawled on the training ground during the exercises, you could tell that the soldiers were not accustomed to military service. To boost their morale, they were forced to sing military marches every night. Even we became unbearably sad to watch them marching with songs on the plats, illuminated by the purple rays of the setting sun. In mid-July, part of the squad, about 1/10 of each department, led by the 2nd Department, moved to Tunghua. There were rumors that our entire detachment would soon be relocated there as well. Asabu from the Takagi section and Sato from the training section were assigned to the part of the squad transferred to Tunghua. The reason for the relocation was explained to us by the fact that hostilities might soon begin, but at that time none of us had any idea of the danger hanging over Japan. There was a lot more work, and more often we had to work in laboratories all night long. Because of sleep deprivation and fatigue, accidents with deadly bacteria became more frequent, and the number of infectious diseases among the personnel increased. If you value your life, be careful, Sujitsuka, the military doctor warned us almost every day. There were many cases of infectious diseases, and they occurred for a variety of reasons, but the main cause was absent-mindedness and inattention. When seeding bacteria, the worker kept having to calcify the platinum loop. The laboratory technician Sagawa kept telling, "Be careful how you burn the loop. If you put it into the flame very sharply, the bacteria can fly around and get on your hands and other parts of your body." Such an accident happened to my fellow countryman Kusuno, with whom we shared a room. Kusuno was admitted to the hospital suspecting he had the plague. Turning to the barracks from work one deep night, I smelled in our room the odor of carbolic acid, an odor I was tired of, which I had just got rid of by escaping from the laboratory. At the door of the room I stopped involuntarily in a premonition of something evil. Hamanaka and Morishima were in bed, but awake. What had happened? Yukinishino's been taken to the hospital. They say he has the plague, Morishima replied. I was stunned. I had firmly believed that since Kusuno and Morishima worked in the meteorological section of the 2nd Division, they were in no danger of contracting the plague. 3 days ago, Kusuno had been sent to help in the nursery where Hayashida worked, to deal with the rats that had recently been arriving from everywhere. Had this happened recently, at the nursery? I asked. Yes, it must have been there. When he was taken to the hospital, he said it was nothing serious, but we got shots too. No matter what you say, it's still scary, Morishima said. I wasn't afraid for myself, since we had regular anti-plague shots, but Kusuno's accident worried me. There was no telling how it would end. He could have died. Well, I'll run to the hospital, I said. Or maybe it's better not to go. After all, A.K. in Morishima grumbled. Yes, but we're countrymen. So I went to the hospital. In the corridor of the hospital, lit by the yellowish light of electric lamps, there was a deep silence, and I was afraid of the sound of my own footsteps. The duty officer blocked my way and asked suspiciously, "What do you want? At this hour?" I explained to him that I was working in the plague section and asked about Kusuno's condition. Just then, the wall clock began to strike. Bom, 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 bom. I counted 12 beats. The clerk hesitated for a moment, but then replied carelessly, "Since you work in this section, you might be allowed a date, but not today. It's too late now. Come back when the doctor is here." As I turned and walked toward the exit, he threw me back. But there doesn't seem to be any cause for concern. They say he has a mild form. I was somewhat relieved. But then I remembered that when I returned to the barracks, my comrades had not uttered a word. How could I explain that they had not opened mouths? When I came to the barracks, the block duty officer was about to leave our room. "Did you go to the hospital?" he asked, though he had probably already been told. "Go to bed at once or you'll be pecking your nose tomorrow." Then he turned toward Hamaka, who was sitting with his head down, and asked, grinning, "The young lady must be waiting for you, worrying, eh?" I didn't understand what he meant at first, but then I realized that he was probably talking about Imado's girlfriend. Before I could dry off from the disinfectant shower, I laid down in bed and involuntarily glanced over at Morishima. With eyes and facial expressions, we tried to talk about Hamanaka, who lay curled up under the wool blanket. Sainsbury Dut, which many asked quietly. "Has she gone anywhere?" "Me say to Tankwa," but Morishima began, but then Hamanaka's irritated, muffled voice came from under the blanket. "Set up." We shut up. I wanted to object, but then Hamanaka's tearful voice came again. I imagined his condition, and feeling compassion for the misfortune of lovers suffering in separation, decided to leave him alone. I got up quietly and turned off the light. A friend goes to the hospital, staying to bed. I had intended to go to the hospital early the next morning, but since, in spite of my fatigue, I could not fall asleep for a long time after going to bed, I woke up only at the signal of rising. I quickly jumped out of bed and only then remembered to check on Kusuno, but I didn't have time. I immediately went to the laboratory, glancing in the direction from which Hayashida would appear. Finally, there was Hayashida. "Oh, great misfortune!" I shouted to him instead of greeting him. "What is it?" he asked, looking at me with wide-open eyes. "Do you know that Kusuno has contracted the plague?" "Really? How did it happen?" "Yukon Sunino was sent to work for you the other day." "Oh, that's your countryman." "Yes, that's him. It seems he was infected the same day. What happened that day?" "I didn't have much time. I was in a hurry." "I don't know. This is the first I've heard from you. I think he was transplanting rats and something happened." Hayashida seemed to be trying to remember something. There was a look of confusion in his eyes. I had to leave for work. "Oh, shit. What could have happened?" Hayashida tried to remember. He'd been admitted to the hospital, but I hadn't seen him. "I'm thinking of going to see him at lunchtime," I shouted on my way. "I'll go with you too." I turned around at the sound of Hayashida's voice and nodded and ran to work. On this day, we were busy reseeding plague bacilli as usual. At work, I asked Code how plague is contracted and about the symptoms of the disease. My question was related to Kusuno's disease. Although I knew that fleas carry the plague bacteria, I had no clear idea how the bacteria enter the body. There are cases in which there is no way to say that the infection was due to negligence alone. It is generally believed that on the corpses of rats treated with boiling water, there can no longer be fleas. But in fact, in some cases, there may be live fleas, and therefore germs, and if so, then... With this preface, Koida began his account of how plague infection can occur. From his account, we learned the following. Hitherto it was believed that the infection was due to the fact that the plague bacilli, which had overflowed into the pre-gastric cavity of the flea, was spewed into the wound by the bite. But now some scientists say that plague infection in humans occurs in a slightly different way. The bitten person starts scratching and damages the skin with his fingernails, and the plague bacilli brought on the skin by the flea penetrate into the body. Also, when scratching, the bacilli can stick to the fingertips and then enter the body through the mouth and nose. At lunchtime, Hayashida and I, who was waiting for me outside the canteen, went to the hospital. We were told that Kusuno was still lying in the isolation ward. In fact, all of the squad's hospital rooms were isolation rooms, but for those with infectious diseases, the isolation rooms were in the very back of the building. Can't go in there. It's dangerous. Perhaps it is better not to go, the military doctor suddenly said in response to my request. Why? Is he very bad? I was worried when I heard the word dangerous. No, I wouldn't say that. But it is not impossible that you may become infected. That is why I tell you that it is dangerous to visit now. If we could be sure there was no danger, he'd be released from the hospital, so you'd better not go. It was hard to agree with the doctor's arguments, but we had to listen. The doctor was clearly in a bad mood, but I still ask, what stage is the disease in? Stage. If I tell you the stage, you'll hardly understand anything anyway. Yes, that's how it is. If he's not dead, there's nothing to worry about. As far as I knew about the plague, the doctor was probably telling the truth, but I felt humiliated. I hated my superiors, but I didn't trust them. I left the hospital worried about Kusuno. Maybe it will be all right, Hayashida muttered sadly. He says there's nothing to worry about, but it's easy to say. But what is Kusuno's situation in reality? I said to him with irritation, frustrated by the failed visit to the patient. Like Hayashida, I couldn't get rid of the troubling thoughts that had arisen in my mind. We felt that our superiors were hiding the real state of affairs from us. I took out the milk candy I brought for Kusuno from my pocket. Let's eat some, shall we? Now, come on. And Hayashida sent 2 pieces into his mouth at once. I wonder what they feed at the hospital, he said, thinking of Kusuno. Our darkest assumptions were realized. We never saw Kusuno again. Back with Akashi, the individual movies of the ones shown to us were old and shabby. During the show, it seemed like it was raining continuously on the screen. That day, we were shown a movie about the living conditions of microbes, filmed on the basis of experiments conducted at one time in the detachment. In particular, it described the ability of some species of bacteria to tolerate freezing and drying. Microbes are particularly resistant to the effects of low temperatures, bacilli of plague, cholera, various festering cocci, and a number of other bacteria in freezing retain viability, and after thawing again begin to multiply. The resistance of bacteria to drying is very low. Some of them die within a few hours after drying. Especially unstable to drying pathogens of influenza, plague, and cholera, relatively resistant cocci or bacilli of typhus and diphtheria. Koch's bacilli and staphylococci in dried form do not die for quite a long time, from several tens of days to several months. The causative agents of tetanus and anthrax do not die even when boiled. All these conclusions have been repeatedly tested in practice. To conduct bacteriological warfare, it is necessary to know the climatic and meteorological conditions of the proposed area of military operations and the viability of bacteria in these conditions, because no matter how many bacteria were grown and no matter how high was their virulence, if you ignore the environment and the conditions of their life, it is impossible to fully utilize the power of this new terrible weapon. There was a special section in the detachment whose sole task was the continuous and careful observation of the influence of meteorological conditions on the activity of pathogenic bacteria. Schechnia are particularly sensitive to fluctuations in temperature. Most of them live and retain their virulence at temperatures from about 25 to 42-43 degrees above zero. The best temperature for them is about 37 degrees above zero. Plague bacilli multiply even at 5 degrees above zero. The question of which bacteria and in which cases it is best to use can be considered largely settled. What do you think? Now you understand why we are so interested in the plague, Sagawa kept whispering to us as the movie went on. After the movie ended, we went outside. The July sun was slanting toward the west, but the air was so hot that it was hard to breathe. Blinded by the bright sunlight, I squeezed my eyes shut because my eyes were used to light. Suddenly, someone put an arm around my shoulders. It was Akashi. I rejoiced and felt myself blush. So he's not dead. He's alive. It flashed across my mind, and I hurried to ask about his health. Every TN, how is your health? Belgian, he replied, somewhat embarrassed. As before, Akashi was wearing a civilian suit. I was very pleased and happy to see that Sagawa and Koida were also welcoming him. With your permission, I'll take him away from you for a while, Akashi said quietly to Sagawa and looked at me affectionately like a loving father. Meijin, please. We have no more classes today, Sagawa replied. And I, escorted by the stares of everyone present, proudly departed with Akashi. It's still hot. Where should we go? There's nothing to buy you at my apartment. I sent my wife back home. The motherland. Do you think it's already dangerous here? I asked, referring to my proposed move to Tonkua. No, I can hardly speak of danger, but I am rarely here. After our meeting, I soon left the unit and returned only yesterday. Okinawa has fallen. Where are we now? Where is our army? I peppered him with questions. By asking them, I hoped to find out whether or not we would ever use the new weapon, which is designed to terrify the whole world. I was also hoping to hear some optimistic predictions from Akashi, but he only gave me a meaningless ahem, and then, apparently this fall will be decisive for the outcome of the war. I realized that Akashi had taken me with him to distract me from my heavy thoughts. Our feet carried us to the shop. Akashi entered the shop from the back door and walked with me into a small room where no one was present. He was obviously well known here. "Give us something like this, if you have any," he said to the man who had entered. Soon chocolates and whiskey appeared in front of us. For a while we talked about the native side. Toward the end, Akashi, savouring the whiskey, spoke. "Yes, perhaps this is the time when the hardest days are coming for Japan." "Are you going somewhere else again?" I asked him after a short pause. "Ahem, I've had a lot of work lately. Our enemies are all around us in Harbin. It must be dangerous there?" "It's equally dangerous here and there," Akashi laughed. I still didn't know exactly how old he was. All the freelancers who told me about him didn't know exactly either. At first glance, Akashi looked to be in his 40s, but on closer inspection, he was no more than 30. I wondered how he could keep a simple and gentle expression on his face. After all, he was responsible for the counterintelligence work that caught spies who were trying to infiltrate our squad. He was fluent in 5 foreign languages, but never showed it unnecessarily. That was probably one of the reasons why I had boundless respect for him and looked up to him as a hero. That was my last meeting with Akashi. From then till August 1945,